we killed ISIS leader al-Baghdadi. He's dead. He's dead as a doornail. And he didn't die bravely either. I will tell you that. He should have been killed years ago. Another president should have gotten him.
Welcome back. President Trump today touting the killing of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, but also blaming former President Obama for not killing the ISIS leader during his presidency. With me now is Nick Rasmussen, who was director of the National Counterterrorism Center during the Obama administration and was in the Situation Room during the mission that killed Osama bin Laden. He remained in that position for the first year of the Trump administration. He's now an NBC News national security and intelligence analyst. Nick, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. As somebody who was sitting in the Situation Room while Osama bin Laden was killed, what is your reaction to one, the president saying that Obama should have gotten Baghdadi, and two, saying that Osama bin Laden was not that big of a deal until the World Trade Center happened?
Well, I don't know quite how to react to that, Katie. Of course, getting Baghdadi was a priority for the Obama administration, and working in a partnership with Iraqi security forces, and at a later stage in cooperation with the Syrian Kurds that's taken us into the current phase of the fighting in Iraq and Syria. It was always a priority. But tracking down these terrorist leaders is a meticulous, difficult, challenging bit of work. It takes time. Sometimes it takes a long time. And often it ends up happening rather quickly once you come across a key piece of intelligence. And that seems to have been what triggered the onset of this operation some months ago. So I wouldn't necessarily think of it as legitimate criticism that we weren't going after Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, because of course we were. Go ahead.
Let me ask you this other question. The president was very forthcoming in describing how he said Baghdadi died. He said he didn't die a hero, he died a coward. He was crying, whimpering, and screaming. And he brought 3 kids with him to his death. He knew the tunnel had no end. From your experience, the crying, the whimpering, the screaming, is that information the president would have been able to obtain in watching this raid or in speaking to people afterwards?
Well, I'm not exactly sure where he would have gotten that information, based on the way he was probably monitoring the operation in the Situation Room. And I would actually rely much more on what you're hearing out of the Pentagon, either from sources at the podium. I understand the chairman of the Joint Chiefs today was, of course, speaking about the operation. And in coming days, we'll hear more about it from the actual operators, I would imagine. And so I would take much more what they say as being gospel here, rather than something that the president is saying in a much more political vein. He's clearly, as one of your previous guests said, looking to revel in this. And so I think some of the details are probably being amplified. Well, which is a nice way of putting it.
In talking about how the leader died a coward and giving all that detail, does that help us in the fight against ISIS? Does it hurt us in the fight against ISIS? How do those comments play?
Again, in the end, I'm not sure it affects the ISIS audience one way or the other. This is an audience that isn't likely to be persuaded to back away from their ideology, to back away from what they are doing, trying to target Americans, trying to target Western nations. But it does, I think, put us in a less positive light with our partners in the region. Again, the idea that we're somehow bragging or talking boastfully about what is, in a sense, difficult, hard, dirty work, targeting terrorists who are trying to kill us and eliminating them from the battlefield. It's not a simple business, and it shouldn't be talked about in trivial ways.
What about all the detail that he revealed yesterday in that 47-minute presser?
Well, again, I watched that presser, and I was kind of wincing along the way as certain key details came out. I don't think there was any one detail that I would single out and say, oh, wow, that is a breach of security. But, our special operations community, treats its tactics very protectively, as they should. They have another mission tomorrow and the next day and the year after that and the week after that and the month after that. And so anything you do that talks about how they do their business, whether it's how many aircraft were involved or how they were flying or where they were coming from or how much time they spent on the compound, these are all details that don't need to be revealed, certainly don't need to be revealed in a way that might give our adversaries some kind of insight or advantage.
Are we in a good position going forward to locate and eliminate or fight against terrorists, stop it from happening. Now that the president the president's been doing this for the past few years, been undermining our relationships with allies overseas. Are we still in a good position to fight the war against terror today with the way the president has treated our allies?
Well, unfortunately, the effort to go after terrorists abroad and to prevent terrorists from succeeding at what they're trying to do requires us to be present and forward deployed around the world. And that's obviously something that the president isn't comfortable with. He believes that we need to withdraw from these conflict zones, bring our forces home, end these so-called forever wars. But I think as many analysts have pointed out, we were actually doing what we were doing in Syria with a pretty significant economy of force. We were not there with tens of thousands of troops. We were working with partners, as your question suggests, and we were having impact. And what I worry about is if you flash forward 6 months and we actually implement and execute some of the decisions the president has made with respect to Syria going forward, I'm not sure we'd be able to execute the kind of operation that was executed over the weekend. And that's not a place we want to be.
Nick Rasmussen. Nick, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Katie.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.